Here's your bracket members: Dave Gilbert, Steve Boehner, Rafael Flores, Walter Gleason, Nikita Lear, Cade Nelson, Logan Smith, Joey Wolf, Caden Gasser. This is the Bracket U with your host, Coach Tonsoni.
Hello, all you bracket fans out there. I'm Brian Tonsoni. Sorry about the name. That's a little inside joke with our Indiana community. My name is Coach Tonsoni, not Tom Sony, but we had a few people who misunderstood that. So for you bracket fans, it's really Brian Tonsoni. I'm here, and our high school students are playing basketball tonight, so they're unable to join us on the live stream, and I've called in an A-team of bracketologists. Graham Doreen is with us. Graham, share with everyone where they can find your work and your history in bracketology.
I'm at Graham Doreen on Twitter, Doeren, and you can find me at grahamdoren.wordpress.com or grahamdorenbracketology.wordpress.com. But really, I've been into bracketology for as long as I can remember. In 2012, I was a part of the NCAA's mock bracket committee. We went down during the ACC tournament. We attended games in Atlanta, and the same weekend as the Rio committee, we were working simultaneously to put together a bracket. So yeah, been involved in bracketology for quite a long time, and really is a passion of mine.
Well, it's always good to talk brackets and basketball with you. And also joining us is Alan Bykowski from a snow-covered Wisconsin. Alan, share with our listeners a little bit about your background and your Marquette Warriors.
Well, I have been doing brackets about the same amount of time Graham has been. I started, I think, first in 2011. And when I was between websites that I was writing for, I took a couple years off, which is why my website, which is crackedsidewalks.com, doesn't have as long of a history, even though we were in the Matrix back in 11, 12, 13 as well. I am also on Twitter at BrewCity1977. And last night I was in the building at Fiserv Forum when Omax Prosper tipped in with 1.6 seconds left to beat Xavier. And it was absolutely electric. Just a phenomenal night. Nights like that are the reason that I love college basketball.
It's a lot of fun. And I think for the record, I'm an IU guy. Alan is Marquette, and Graham, you're Duke, I believe.
No,
that was Shelby.
That's Shelby. I am Kansas and Virginia Tech, went to both schools.
All right. So you can take our takes on those schools and throw them out the window, I guess, or maybe we're too harsh on our schools one way or another. But, gentlemen, Saturday is the NCAA reveal. They'll reveal 1 through 16, which tells us a lot about what the committee is thinking, and it gives us bracket guys a chance to compare to what the committee's doing, and we're really 3 or 4 weeks away from tournament time. Conference tournament time. So it's right in the heat of basketball. So let's get started with our number 1 seeds. And I'll start, and then we'll go around the table for the 2 seeds and so forth, and tell me what you like, don't like, or issues that our listeners need to follow. But in some order, Alabama, Purdue, Kansas, and Houston is what we're likely to go with tomorrow in our bracket update. Alan, we'll start with you. Your thoughts about that 1 seed line that we've come up with?
I really don't think there's any argument against those 4. At this point, I would question anybody that didn't have those 4 teams in some order. You can debate whether you like Alabama or Houston's metrics better. You can debate Purdue's entire body of work. You can debate Kansas's quad 1 wins. But in terms of the 4 teams that are going to be on the top line, I would be, barring some sort of shocking result with Purdue tonight, I expect those to be the 4 teams that are going to be on that top line come Saturday morning.
Graham, your thoughts?
I completely agree. And I think for me, Houston is number 4. The other 3, I think you can argue in any order, and that would be reasonable.
Yeah, it's really become clear-cut. There's been some Arizona talk in the past couple of weeks. 3 weeks ago, before Tennessee failed, has lost some games. But really, I think Baylor, we'll talk number 2 seeds coming up. Baylor's probably the biggest threat to that number 1 seed line. So, Graham, go ahead. Share with us who you have on the 2 seed line.
Baylor is my top 2 seed, followed by Texas, then UCLA and Arizona. Kind of interesting having 2 Big 12 teams and 2 Pac-12 teams, but I feel pretty good about those 2 seeds. Maybe Arizona or UCLA could possibly be subbed out.
Alan, your 2 seed line or thoughts on Graham's?
Yeah, I'm looking at UCLA, Baylor, Texas, Tennessee. I briefly had Texas up to the 1 line. That was before the loss to Kansas and then the subsequent loss to Texas Tech that I think really kept them out of that mix. Tennessee was a difficult call, but their result last night, when you look at the average of their results and their predictives, there's a gap between them and the teams that are on the 3 line. And that's the reason that I've got Tennessee in there and think that they're deserving of a 2 seed right now. UCLA and Baylor, I think, are pretty obvious 2 seed picks at this point.
Yeah, we moved, Tennessee was up there at the top for a while. We have them as our top 3 seed, but they are a team that I think you got to look at. And it's really good that you brought that up because we talk to our students and we talk to our listeners and followers like it's body of work and recency bias. I know teams lose 3 out of 4, but good teams lose games. Kansas had their run where they had some losses. You cannot forget what Tennessee has done, and some of the teams they've beaten Texas, and they just turn around and beat the number 1 team in Alabama. I do think they're very deserving for consideration. We have them as our number 1 3 seed. But I do think they can be a 2 seed. But those top 9 teams are pretty solidly entrenched. I'm not sure there'll be a whole lot of movement unless someone has a really tough run down the stretch. So, Alan, take us to your 3 seed line.
Right now I have Arizona, Virginia, Gonzaga, and UConn. Arizona and Virginia are the 2 that kind of differentiate themselves from the rest. They were teams that I really looked at for that last 2 seed and kind of put those ones in a bag with Tennessee. And when I reached in, the Volunteers were what came out. Similarly, Gonzaga and UConn were in a group that I was looking at with Marquette. And I'm sure that my fellow Golden Eagle fans won't like seeing Marquette below UConn right now. But when you look at the best wins that those teams have, when you look at the resume averages, it just UConn's overall body of work, even though they haven't had a great Big East season, they started at the beginning of the year at the top of KenPom, at the top of all the metrics, and I think most people had them number 1 overall. So even though they've fallen, they had a heck of a lot of cushion between them and falling out of the top 16, which is why when I reevaluated today, I thought they really need to be on that 3 seed line.
Okay, so you're going to make me do some work after the podcast because I just switched UConn and Marquette about 20 minutes before we went on air, and now the Marquette guy is telling me that UConn's ahead of Marquette. Graham, your thoughts on that? That's interesting. Those 2 teams, on that 3-4 seed line, and there's some other thoughts there like Gonzaga. We have the Gonzaga on the 3 seed line. But you could make an argument that they're a 4 seed too. There's some real close resumes between the 3 and the 4. Your thoughts?
Agree with you. I have Tennessee, UVA, Gonzaga, and I'm a Marquette guy here. So Alan, you seem to be the one off.
You're welcome.
I look at Marquette and I see they did that huge blowout victory of Baylor, who I have number 5 overall in the non-conference schedule. They beat UConn, they beat Xavier in what was truly a fantastic game last night. All at home, I will say that. I think that is something that could push Marquette a little bit further down. I do think that's a little bit of a warning sign. But I will say, anytime it's close, I always go to the team who is at the top of the conference. And when I was comparing UConn and Marquette, and it was such a close call, I wanted to go with the team that I think is going to win the conference.
So I just threw up their nitty-gritty sheet for Alan to look at again. The one that Graham and I appreciate. But we were talking before we got on the show, Alan, a little bit too, that conference record and conference standing are not an official criteria of the NCAA, but does it creep into discussions when people are voting in that room? Graham, you've been part of the mock selection in the past. I have not been. We wonder if it is, Marquette is ahead of UConn and it's really close. Not official. You're not supposed to, but does that creep in? Your thoughts, Alan, on that?
Well, what I'm really looking at, and I'm trying as much as possible to strip that conference record out of it, because as good as Marquette has been in conference, and believe me, these are heights that I'm a very optimistic Marquette fan. I had them third when I picked in the preseason, and a lot of the people on the East Coast said that I was crazy for where I was at on this team. I was bullish on them, but overall body of work, you look at the three best wins Marquette has. They've got UConn, they have Baylor, they have Creighton. All of those are at home. Whereas when you look at the top of UConn sheet, you've got Alabama, who's a 1 seed, that was on a neutral floor. You've got Iowa State, blew them out on a neutral floor. Similar wins in that they have both Creighton and Marquette at home. So you've got more quad 1A victories. You've got more quad 1A victories away from home. The one knock and the one hesitancy that I have putting UConn up that high is when you look at their road record, they're 4-5 in true road games. And they're the only team that I'm looking at in this range that has a losing record away from home. Marquette, Gonzaga, both winning records away from home. It's a little bit more compelling for them. But right now, just overall body of work. And it's just those huge wins at the top for me, for UConn. You can't ignore a 15-point win over Alabama, 18-point win over Iowa State. That's some really heavy stuff for a team to overcome, especially when both those were on neutral courts, whereas Marquette's win over Baylor, as much fun as it was being in the building that night, was at Fiserv Forum.
So you bring up a good point. I'm going to go back to Graham on this. We talked about sometimes it's not the eye test, but we have enough metrics here to look past the records. That records get you in, but now when you're comparing UConn and Marquette, these predictive metrics for Connecticut, 7, 6, 8, a net of 8. And then when we scroll back to Marquette, which is a good quality team, did I pass them? Yeah. 17, 12, 16 in the predictive metrics. So, and the net of 14, that is a slight lean towards UConn has played better. You referenced those double-digit wins against high quality. That helps those metrics. So, Graham, again, you and I were on the side of Marquette. Have we been swayed?
No, to be honest with you, not for me. As important as the quality metrics are, I think the resume-based metrics are more important. And if you look at that, the indicators for UConn we should be talking about whether they're a 5 seed, perhaps. When you look at the resume-based metrics, I don't think that's the case. I think they're fighting for a 3 seed, but I think they're just barely missing out on it as the 13th overall seed. And just looking at one more thing that I think goes to Marquette's favor is if you look at the quad 1 plus quad 2 overall record, they have an extra win and one less loss compared to UConn. And I think that's just enough to sway the day.
Regardless, it's real close. I'd like to talk and get your thoughts on Gonzaga as well. It always, the Houstons and Gonzagas where the league is not as deep and the quad 1 numbers are a little bit. We comfortable with Gonzaga? All of us have them on the 3 seed line. I've had some Twitter conversations, or not conversations, people yelling about Gonzaga being on the 3 seed line. Graham, and then Alan, real quick, your thoughts on Gonzaga.
I'm not really comfortable there. I think they could easily get passed by some teams below them that finish with some quality wins. At the same time, you look at all their metrics across the board, whether it's predictive, resume-based, net, they all point to a team that's right hanging in between the 3 and the 4 seed line, probably leaning 3. So I think a 3 seed is appropriate.
I feel similar. And when you look at the top of Gonzaga's resume, the heavy lifting that they did and the losses that they took were, again, all away from home. Alabama, Xavier, Michigan State, all teams that they beat on a neutral court. Xavier's particularly important there because that's a team that they're competing with in that 3, 4, 5 range, teams that are all somewhat close. and then all of their losses, 4 of their 5 losses are top 10 teams in the net away from home. The Loyola Marymount is definitely something that kind of sticks out. But once we're getting to this range, Marquette's got the loss to Wisconsin at home. UConn has a quad 3 loss. There's a number of teams once we get past the 2 line that have something there that doesn't make you feel quite as comfortable, which is why I think that you can overlook that. And Gonzaga certainly did challenge themselves. Their non-conference strength of schedule is 6. It's not like they didn't put the effort in to going out, getting good games, and performing pretty well against them too.
And they have a chance to get that Loyola win back too tonight. They're on the road at Loyola. And if they win, I think that helps the committee kind of not erase that. You don't get rid of that, but it will kind of change that. Go ahead, Graham.
Well, one thing that I think is interesting that you pointed out, Alan, I think quadrant records really do matter by themselves. Just the totality of what the record is, I think, has inherent weight. But I also break it down within that, right? So for me, Xavier might not be a quad 1A win, but I know they're a team competing for a protected seed. So I still give that more value than, you know, what a quad 1B win would otherwise be worth. And same deal with Marquette losing at home to Wisconsin. The net says this is a quadrant 3 home loss, but I know Wisconsin's a tournament team for me. They're competing for a spot in the bracket. So that's not as bad as losing at home to Loyola Marymount. So I think you have to kind of weigh both of these things. What is the quadrant record telling you, but also what's the actual quality behind those teams?
So let's move to the 4 seeds. You're either going to have Marquette or UConn on that seed line, and then we have UConn, Xavier, Iowa State, and Kansas State. Go ahead, Alan. Your 4 seeds or any team that you think should be into consideration on that seed line.
The only difference that I have there, which we've already litigated a little bit, is I've got Marquette there instead of UConn.
Right.
But I think Iowa State very clearly there. Xavier, I'm comfortable with. I have them there. I also have Kansas State there. I do have some worries about those 2 teams, though. When it comes to seeding, more often than not, your predictive metrics are going to weigh in more so, whereas the resume metrics are what gets you into the field. And Xavier's predictive metrics are not great. Kansas State's predictive metrics for a team in this range are flat out bad. Kansas State's average is below 30. And then also when you look at the net rankings, Xavier's at 25 in the net, which isn't terrible. It's enough that right now they are just barely a quadrant 1A win for Gonzaga. You were mentioning that, Graham. But the thing with Xavier is, historically speaking, if you go back, more than 80% of the teams, 83% of the teams selected to the top 16 were also top 16 in the net. And of those teams that weren't selected, the vast majority of them were 22 or better. Every now and then you'll get that outlier. You'll get a Providence last year, Wisconsin, somebody who does happen to sneak in that's outside of 22. But I'm really looking at that 22 number as a little bit of a cutoff. That makes me nervous about Xavier. And there's really 3 teams I think that I'm looking at hard for that last spot right now. It'll make you happy to hear Indiana's one of them, Tom.
Thank you.
Might have to take a little bit more of a look after last night, as heartbreaking as that loss had to be. The other 2 that I'm looking at, and I know a lot of people are going to mention Miami. I don't really like Miami in that spot. I like St. Mary's, and I like San Diego State as possibly getting in there. And St. Mary's was a team that I know that we're going to talk about. Their metrics really aren't all that bad. They don't have the top of the resume sort of wins that you would like to see, which is why I'm a little bit hesitant on them. They also have 2 quad 3 losses, another thing that kind of shies me away from them a little bit. But I think they're a team that, considering where their net is at, we do have to take a longer look at, even though I would have them outside of the top 16 right now.
Alan, I'm glad you brought up the net, because we go back and forth. You know, the net is a sorting tool. You'll hear that all the time. But what that means to us is that you just don't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But I do think the net matters, because it is a combination, a little bit of, you know, the resume with the predictive. It's the NCAA's, you know, pride and joy, if you will. And I do think it reflects how you play. And I do think when it comes down to a team like St. Mary's at 6, I do think that adds to their value in the committee's eyes. Not that it's the net of 6, but that represents that they've played their schedule and played it, rather decently and well in comparison to others. Graham, we'll go up to you on the 4 seed line.
I like Kansas State, Iowa State, UConn, we already talked about, was 13th overall for me. And Miami's the team that I do put in the 4 line that I'm nervous about. I think at the bracket reveal, it's a very good chance they'll be a 5 seed. But they're 21-5 overall, have a great win over Virginia. And the predictive metrics, as Alan mentioned, that's the thing that's really holding them back. But I'm curious how the committee's going to treat them because, what happened last year is not supposed to matter, theoretically. But we all saw Miami went to the Elite Eight. We know that Nigel Pack was good at Kansas State. He's just as good at Miami. We know that Isaiah Wong's been a terrific basketball player last year. This year, there's just, for me personally, I just think Miami's a better basketball team than their predictive metrics indicate. I don't think it's a coincidence that they're 21-5. And if you look at Jim Larinaga teams, they've traditionally started very poorly in non-conference, turned it around. Even that year Miami won the ACC championship, ended up getting a 2 seed. I actually didn't think they had a 2 seed quality resume. I think they got a bump because the committee just thought, well, if you looked at them in the ACC, they're better than that resume indicates. So I kind of think Miami might get that bump because if you look at KPI and strength of record, they're both in 4 seed, 3 seed territory, 10 and 16 respectively. I just think they're a better basketball team than their predictive metrics indicate. So for me, Miami sneaks in there to that 4 line.
And Alan, last year at this time for the NCAA reveal, Providence at 30 was in. But I do like your number of 22 because historically, I think that has been true. We've looked at trends all the way back since the net started, and even in the RPI days, we have our spreadsheets saved. And those kinds of trends matter. There's another trend when you get down to the 8 or 9 seed with teams 40 and above or 45 and above. In the whatever metric was being used that we've kind of identified. And we're a little nervous to use it absolutely without looking at other issues. And Miami is probably, they're our number 1 5 seed for us as well. So depending on, where we go with that, we do believe Miami can move up there. So Graham, I think it's back to you for the 5 seeds.
In order, there's Xavier, St. Mary's, San Diego State, and Indiana. I did consider, so I do want to make a quick statement about that. Indiana's my last 5 seed, but even they were under consideration for the 4 seed line, which I think tells you how good the 5 seeds are this year. They are all really pushing on that 4 seed line. I think for me, San Diego State has really good metrics across the board, but they just don't have the quality of wins when you really dive into it that I would expect to see from a 4 seed. So they actually would be the one team that would surprise me of those 4 if they were a 4 seed on Saturday.
And so, Alan, your 5 seed line?
It's right now, I mentioned 3 of them earlier, the 3 that I was considering: St. Mary's, Indiana, San Diego State, and then Miami would be the other team that I have in there on the 5 line. One thing, though, that I do look at with Miami as far as how they might not have started like gangbusters, and they had a respectable non-con in terms of record. But part of the reason that I think that they're really turning it around and looking better is because the ACC sucks. And there are a lot of teams that could be turning it around and looking better right now against an ACC of the quality that we're seeing. Virginia, I firmly believe in. Other than that, I am skeptical of just about every team in that conference, Duke included.
Yeah, I agree. We have Creighton on the 5 seed line, and I know that's kind of maybe a reach a little bit. We have San Diego State as the top 6, so we're right. You guys have given me something with Marquette, Connecticut to study tonight, and then I'm going to go really dive into San Diego State as well, moving up a seed line, at least for us, to 5, because you guys are considering them for the 4. But with Creighton and the 13 net for us, a 29 strength of schedule, and all their losses were bunched together, including a very key injury for three of those games. At 8-8 in quad 1 and 2, I think the overall resume, I think the committee's going to give them a benefit. I don't know that they can crack the 4 seed line, even if with a good run. So I might have them at their peak before they've peaked. But we have been higher on Creighton all year than a lot of bracketologists have been. And I just think that they, again, I don't like using the eye test, but I think there's numbers to back it up with strength of schedule and some of their wins since in the last few weeks. But that's the one outlier we have on the 5 seeds. Alan, go ahead and share the 6 seeds, your 6 seed.
Creighton would definitely be where I am starting there. I have not done a complete rescrub since earlier this week. I was going to be spending a heck of a lot of tomorrow after maybe a little bit of Quantumania viewing, digging into a full rescrub. But joining Creighton right now, I would have Illinois, TCU, and I'm probably on the numbers. Auburn should be up there, but man, I do not like them there. Bringing up Creighton, though, was something that I did want to mention as well.
Yeah, go ahead.
Part of the reason, because I'm looking at Creighton and wondering if they really should get consideration for that 4 line. Right now, they have a 10.7 average metric, the predictive metrics. 10.7 is their average of the 3. That's the 10th best in the country. If you're looking at predictives more so when it comes to seeding, Creighton should be up there. If the top 16 teams are typically going to come from the top 16 in the net, Creighton's at 13 in the net. So they also then would possibly fit in as a 4 seed. I'm not sure that they have quite the heft at the top. That Arkansas win, as fun as that game was to watch, doesn't have the same value that I think we thought it did back in November when they were in Maui. But that is a team that I think, you consider Kalkbrenner missed 3 games. They lost all 3 of those. The last of which was another one that I was at. That was against Marquette. I'm not complaining that Kalkbrenner was out that game. He made a big difference against us last year. He also was ill for 2 of the other losses. The first loss in that stretch was to Arizona, a team that is right on that 2-3 seed edge. So it's not really that bad of a loss. And if you do discount the 3 losses and look at them as a 17-6 team, now suddenly they look a lot more comparable to those teams that are up there. And I'm definitely planning on digging in deeper to Creighton and taking a longer look at whether they might be a team that shocks us and is mentioned in the reveal come Saturday morning.
So you mentioned Illinois. We have them on the 7 seed line, and then we have a question from a viewer. One of my IU guys is in here or was in here watching, and he says the Big Ten beating themselves up again, does that cause seeding problems? So you mentioned Illinois on the 6th line. We're probably going to get to Michigan State and Iowa and a Northwestern here real soon. But Graham, your thoughts. We'll come back to Alan real quick on Quang's question here about a conference. This one particular, the Big Ten, but any conference kind of beating themselves up. How does that end up hurting or helping?
I think the real answer is the committee will tell you, oh, we look at every team individually. In reality, I've noticed, my personal opinion, is when teams beat each other up in conference, it doesn't help the conference. It really doesn't. I think Miami could get that sort of a bump because that record of 21-5 looks really good. When you compare them to some other teams that aren't going to have sterling records, yeah, maybe they've picked up some great wins along the way, but we're human beings. We look at one record that looks really nice and shiny, and then we look at another record that doesn't look nice and shiny. It can be tough to overlook that. Last year, I actually thought Oklahoma was a very good basketball team and deserved to be in the NCAA tournament, but I knew better than to put them in the NCAA tournament because they just lost too many games in a really tough Big 12. I think you're seeing the same thing for example, Oklahoma this year, right? They beat Alabama by 20 some odd points in the non-conference, but they're losing a lot of games in the Big 12. It does not help to get beat up And even look at Kansas and Baylor and Texas, right? Some teams with some absolutely fantastic wins, really, really difficult strengths of schedule. But we're talking right now about which Big 12 team might be on the one line. Should we be talking about more than one Big 12 team up there? So I think, conferences beating themselves up, including the Big 10, it doesn't really do anything to benefit you. I think there's a sweet spot. You typically want to be like the third best conference, where you can just build up some really nice records with some good wins, but not be in the position that you're just adding losses left and right.
You bring up something that I think about all the time, too. In some conferences, you get a lot of road wins. When you start saying this team has a better road win than someone else, well, if the conference is 5 good teams and 8 bad teams, or 7 and 7, you go on the road, you got some easier chances to win on the road. If you're top to bottom tough, home games are brutal to try to win. So there's some problems in using that sometimes for us when you got to go to conference. And then the unbalanced schedules too, to our listener, that creates problems too, because sometimes the luck of the draw, or you have a double bye, double games against someone, and they turn out like Ohio State in the Big Ten right now is really struggling. It'd be good to play Ohio State twice. Some teams only play them once. I think that has to be an issue too. But Alan, your thoughts on conferences, the Big Ten kind of beating themselves up and getting some massive losses from some good teams?
I think it comes down to what you really want at the end of the day. Do you want a number of teams, a smaller number of teams that are highly seeded and have a better route? That's generally what the Big East is doing right now. You see, we're talking about UConn, Xavier, Marquette, maybe Creighton, all being in that, top 4, 5, 6 lines. Providence has slipped a little bit, but is probably still looking like a single-digit seed. And the rest of the league isn't really in the picture at all. Seton Hall briefly flirted with it. I think that loss at Villanova probably killed, or all but killed, their at-large hopes. And then you look at a Big Ten where you might get a lot more bids, but we have a number of those teams. Northwestern is differentiating themselves a bit right now. But probably still in that 7 to 10 range, similar to a Michigan State, similar to an Iowa, similar to, Wisconsin is sitting on the bubble right now. And the team that I think is the two teams that I look at that make me chuckle in the Big Ten are Ohio State and Nebraska. Ohio State was that team who did fantastic in non-conference and really rang up some numbers. And then by tanking, once they got to conference play, it was giving everybody quad 1 and quad 2 wins all over the place, bolstering the resumes of all the teams that were tourney contenders. Nebraska, on the other hand, didn't do enough in non-conference, and now suddenly they're putting it together, and Penn State and Wisconsin and all these other teams find themselves tripping up against the Cornhuskers, and that might cost them bids at the end of the day. It definitely makes things more difficult in terms of seeding, because you're going to knock those teams down, but it might end up getting you more bids at the end of the day. It's just where those bids come and how easy the road is for those teams once they get in.
And as we speak, Maryland has gone on a 21-4 run and now lead the Purdue Boilermakers 50-41 with 9 minutes plus to play in the game. So here we go.
Ready
right?
to talk about that one line again?
Yeah, let's. We're going to reboot and start over maybe, but still a lot of basketball there in that game. Graham, your 6 seed line.
It's really pretty much the same thing that's already been talked about. Creighton's 21 overall as the best. Then Illinois, Michigan State, you had mentioned briefly. I don't love Michigan State's resume, but it's just plain solid, and there's something to be said for that. And then TCU is my final for number 6 seed.
Yeah, we were looking Northwestern, Michigan State, and Illinois. That we got to dive into that as our committee has put some high school kids on it tomorrow during their English class and math class. Have them do that instead. But do some deep dives, because Northwestern's their net of 43 scares me from how high they can get, and their other metrics and non-conference schedule was not very good. But man, they have quality of wins, and they're 7-4 in quad 1. So I think they're starting to get into consideration. But we've had Michigan, we've had Illinois and Duke for a long time. We've dropped Duke now off of that 6 seed line. but yeah, we have San Diego State, TCU, and Michigan State. So we're all getting those teams one seed line off for the most part. And then, 7 seed for us would be Northwestern, Duke, Iowa, Maryland. Graham, going back to you, 7 seed line. This is where it starts to get really crazy with what you value, because you're starting to look at a lot of teams that have similar resumes, or they have good pieces on one side, and then the other teams have good pieces on a resume side or a metric side. And so depending on what you are looking at, you're going to see probably some differences here in our discussion, as well as you would with bracketologists around the country. But go ahead and take a stab at your 7 seeds.
Yeah, speaking of a difference, I have Auburn as my best 7 seed. I was considering them for the 6 line. Northwestern is next, and I really love the wins Northwestern has, but as you mentioned, I'm scared off by those predictive metrics. I just can't see them at the 6 line right now for that reason alone. Iowa has some great wins, so they're hanging in there. And then I'm taking a bit of a stab because this is one of those teams that could really be anywhere between the 7 and the 9 line, possibly even 10, but I don't think so. You have to find somewhere to place Florida Atlantic. This is where I place them, 28th overall.
So we had them a 7 for a long time. I moved them today down to the 8. We discussed off air. I like them for the 7-8. Their resume is not a 7 in my book, but I do think winning the conference. They are down 3 as the second half starts to Middle Tennessee on the road. So there's some bracket impact games going on. Alan, you mentioned Auburn, so I'm gonna put up Auburn's team sheet here. And we're not very high on Auburn, and we might be missing the boat here at Delphi Bracketology. And I'm interested to get your guys' opinion here on this team sheet. What has them on a 7 seed line? Alan, where do you have Auburn currently?
I had them at the end of the 6 line, and the only thing propping them up there is what they did to Missouri the other night.
Okay.
That was one of those results that bumps you up. And I hate Auburn's resume.
Right.
I feel like you look at it and it just, there's so little substance there. Even the overall quad 1, quad 2 record is just 8-8. And then you look at their metrics and 24 average resume, there's no doubt they're going to get selected. And when you factor in the 18.3 average that they have in predictive metrics, when it comes to seeding, the main separating tool that I use, I go through in 2 separate passes. My first pass through, I just place teams into the bracket and pick who those 68 teams are going to be. After that, I get to plugging everybody in. And when it comes to Auburn, I use what I call the RAP score. It's you take the average of the resume, the average of the predictive, so resume and predictive, average those 2 numbers. So for Auburn, that score comes out to 21.15, which is pretty similar to a lot of those teams that we're considering for the 4 line. And number-wise, and I got that from Lucas Harkins, that number tracks with seeding about 80% of the time within a seed line. So when I'm looking at Auburn, they look like they should be plugging in around a 5. They don't quite have that resume, so they get bumped down to the end of the 6. But I know a lot of people have them slipping currently. It's another one where I think about UConn a little bit. Is some of Auburn's slippage just recency bias rather than really looking at the numbers that they've put up? And even though it's not necessarily against who you might want it to be against, what they've done is what they've done, and what their numbers are is what their numbers are. And at the end of the day, you're figuring out how the math equation is going to work to put this team where they go. And that, for me, really a big part of my strength last year was that 7 to 11 range where I really did well with seeding teams. And I think that using the RAP score made a big difference as far as that goes. And that's why I have Auburn a little bit higher than I think some others do.
So there's 2 resume-based metrics on the team sheet, and there's 3 predictive. Do you add the net in as well?
Nope.
Or just use what's on the team sheet?
Just use what's on the team sheet. So when you're looking at the resume average, it's the strength of record and the KPI. Then on the other side, so you average those two, then you average the BPI, KenPom, and Sagarin, whatever those three are. Pick each of those two numbers, average those. That's generally going to line up pretty well with seeding. I'll go through and adjust based on where quality wins are, where road records are. And I think when you get closer to the bubble and those last teams that you're picking, that becomes a little bit less important. You're looking more there at who did you beat and what are your resume numbers looking like. That's why a Rutgers gets in last year, because of who they beat.
Yeah, so that makes sense too, because their net's at 23, right, or 24.
26.
Auburn's sitting at 26 today.
Or 26. That's in that would be a 7, but your average is 21, so that's in the ballpark, which then should tell us, if we're looking at that, if you're in the ballpark with all of that stuff. It's just, I told Graham before you joined us pre-show that we did well in 2016 with wins. We won the bracket matrix with wins. I think we have not adjusted at bracketology, our group, to getting away from wins get you in, as you said, and then the metrics might help move you seed lines or two. So I think we've learned a lesson from you tonight. Graham, your thought on Auburn? When I look at no quad 1A wins, their best win is Arkansas. They do have a nice win against Northwestern. I don't see the quality of wins, but I just told you I may be too stuck on wins. The Missouri wins there too. But your thoughts on Auburn and why you have them up here?
It's very similar to what Alan's talking about. I had a real eye-opening year in 2021 when there were a couple teams that surprised me on the 6th line, and that was San Diego State. Really, them in particular, they drew my attention with, hey, they don't really have good wins. What is the committee looking at here? And it was just across the board. Those result-based metrics and those predictive metrics were good. It didn't really matter the fact that they didn't have these great wins. The committee said, hey, they're consistent. They've got good metrics. And so one of the things I'm always looking for is just consistency. And for Auburn in particular, I think you could kind of come to two conclusions with their metrics. One would be the KPI is sitting at 21, and then those predictive metrics are right at the edge of the 5 seed line. So if you wanted to say, okay, maybe they are around 20, I could buy that. I could buy them as a 6. But I think the net being 26 and strength of record being 27 is a little bit more accurate to who they are. But I am seeing that correlation between their net and their strength of record. And one other example I'd bring up. Last year, Houston had a worse overall seed at 17th overall than any of their metrics. But they were really, truly an exception because they were awful against Quadrant 1. Just really, really bad. Otherwise, no team has ever had a worse overall seed than their worst metric. So looking at this, you see strength of record at 27. You should really be capping it for almost any team, as they're just not going to be worse than 27th overall because all of their metrics tell you they're at least that good.
So I don't want to keep you all night because I could talk for hours with you guys, and we probably need to schedule more of these things because I'm learning a ton, and I can't wait to talk to our young men and our fellow teachers about what we've learned here. So that also is going to apply then to FAU favorably, right? I would think their average. Now I want to take a look at FAU here. I think I still have this up on the screen for those of you who are watching.
We've 17 or 18.
Well, their metrics, their predictive metrics aren't. Their average is going to be 9, 10. So where do you guys have FAU? I know, Graham, you said 7. We have them in the 8. Alan, where do you have FAU?
I've got FAU on the 9.
Okay.
I did have them up a little bit higher earlier. And, I mean, I really don't hate their resume, considering the opportunities that they have. 5-2 in Quadrant 1 and 2 is very good. They do have, including tonight, 3 Quadrant 2 games left, so they can boost that up a little bit. But those predictives, they're the sort of team that when I'm looking at selection, their average of 20.5, you're getting in. They are unquestionably a team that, based on KPI and strength of record, they're getting in. But then when it comes
as
to
an at-large, right? If they lose the conference tournament, okay.
Yeah, as an at-large right now, they would unquestionably be in. But those predictives for me just drag them down, because if that was all they had to go on, you're talking a bubble team at best. They just don't have the numbers that you want to see in that range. So it hurts them, it drags them down, but I think that they would get in. And historically speaking, anybody that goes into the tournament with 3 or fewer losses, which would require them to win out until their conference tournament. But if you go into the selection show with 3 or fewer losses, you're getting in almost universally, pretty much no matter what league you play in, you're going to get a shot. And I think FAU is going to get in. They can probably afford to drop one more of these quadrant 2 games that they have. I think they're really playing with fire if it's any more than that. And I think a lot of people would be disappointed to see them on the outside looking in if they're coming in with 5 losses on Selection Sunday. I don't think that would get it done.
So I'm going to throw a little curveball to us instead of keep going all down the seed lines. I'm going to throw out some names of some schools, and you guys tell me where you have them seated, because I want to spend the last 10 minutes going over the last 4 in and the first 4 out. And then that will be our hour's worth of time that I've taken from you. So Rutgers. Alan, where do you have them?
Rutgers, I'm looking at around that 8-9 range right now.
Yep. Okay.
And I actually wonder if I might be a little bit too low on them. Again, like I was saying, if I'm looking at the predictives as weighing in there, they have awesome predictive metrics. Where they come up on their RAP score is 35.85 as of today. So that is right around a 9 seed, would be appropriate for them. But 22.7 is the average of their predictives, and that's really, really good. So they're a team that I think I might creep up a little bit higher, even though they don't have, obviously, the heft that they had last year at the top of the resume.
We've moved them. They've dropped a few seed lines for us. Graham, question for you is Pittsburgh.
Oh, they're a team I struggle with. I have them on the 10 line right now, but they're a team, if you look at their resume, they could easily be much higher than that, but their predict metrics are really not very strong. And then if you just kind of dig into the actual quality of wins, they're good numerically, but none of them really stand out as truly terrific. So I feel pretty good about Pittsburgh on the 10 line. I think it's really balancing their whole resume.
All right, back to you, Alan, on this question and answer. Missouri.
Missouri, at my last update, I had it a 7, but they definitely took a hit. That was probably a 2 seed line drop, considering how badly they got beaten the other night. Right now, I would look at them around a 9. The thing that I really like about Missouri is some of those wins are great. And even if they fall off a little bit, they're a team that, somewhat similar to Rutgers last year, you look at the things that they have accomplished at the top of the resume, and I think they're a team that's definitely going to be in. The question is where they're going to play themselves in terms of the final overall predictives, because they seem to be one of those teams that they will blow you out or they will get blown out.
Which is an 8, 9, 10 seed. That's going to be an 8, 9, 10 seed probably.
Yep.
We have them as a 9 seed ourselves. Graham, back to you. North Carolina State.
They actually just took a big hit from me going through in my scrubbing process. I actually moved them down to my best 11 seed, and I was shocked to see them that low. But you start to see some of the teams above them, and they just have better metrics really across the board. NC State played a very bad non-conference schedule. They didn't really help themselves at all in the non-conference. Their wins aren't particularly good. So I was really surprised that I had them that low. But if you add it all up, there's just not a ton to love. They're not great numerically from the resume-based metrics. They're 36th average there. They're 38th in the net. They're 41.7 average for predictive metrics. Only 2 wins against Quadrant 1. They actually have a losing overall record against Quadrant 1 and 2 at 6 and 7. I think NC State's in a lot more trouble than people think. They are really a true bubble team at this point.
And you guys are giving me some homework here. We have them on the 8 line, but we've had them 8 or 9 all along. 2 more, and then we'll get to our first 4 out. Let's see who I had here. I'd like to go West Virginia, Alan. They're a team that we struggle with.
I definitely understand that struggle. West Virginia, I had on the 9 line. Then they took another loss, and I feel they rose up meteorically, and they seem to be falling just as quickly. The biggest difficulty that I think they have is just playing in the Big 12.
Right.
And the Big 12 is trying desperately to get 8 teams in. And while everybody talks about the 2011 Big East getting 11 teams in, the record that I look at is the 1991 Big East that got 7 teams in, because it was 7 out of 9, 77.8% of their teams got in. No league has ever put more than that in. If the Big 12 managed to get 8 this year, 80% of the league would be a new record for the most teams in. But it's hard to see West Virginia and Oklahoma State both doing enough to get there, even though they're both surging right now. It's something just tells me one of them is going to end up falling just on the outside. And they ran into the same thing last year. Oklahoma was a team that for a while looked like they might get in. West Virginia looked like they might get in. And at the end of the year, they all ended up falling out. It's tough to have that many good teams in a league without slipping up and teams knocking each other out. And I think West Virginia could be one of those teams that ends up coming up just short because of it.
All right, and last one before we go to our bubble teams, Maryland, Graham. They're going to beat Purdue. They're up 14 with 1:20 to go, just banked in a 3 to go from 11 to 14. But prior to tonight's result, because I won't ask you to scrub live on the show, but where did you have Maryland, and what might a win do for them?
Maybe we should have a TV show or a internet-based show called Live Scrubs. That sounds fun. But
yeah, that's a good idea.
I have Maryland entering tonight as my number 1 9 seed, and I think they just have one of those resumes where nothing really stands out as great, nothing really stands out as bad, just balance kind of out to the 8-9 range. And I would, entering tonight, would have been shocked if they were anywhere else but the 8-9 range. But I'll have to see how a Purdue victory changes that.
Yeah, and what I've done here is I've thrown out a lot of teams from 8, 9, and 10 seeds that I had that we have questions are, and this middle is it can get really cloudy when you start comparing, and it's based on what you prefer as a committee member, but that's what's happening in that the real committee, and then they vote, and these teams get placed, and then they get scrubbed. But I do like, Alan, what you said about looking at those metrics. I'm going to take a look at that this evening. But let's go to our last 4 in, or any order if you want to go 6 or whatever on the 11 seed line, and then your first 4 out, and we'll try to discuss a little bit here, and then we'll call it a night. But Graham, let's start with you. Who are your last 4 teams in that would be playing in Dayton?
In order of best to worst: Kentucky, Wisconsin, USC, Mississippi State. Could be a fun little rematch of that 2015 Final Four game between Kentucky and Wisconsin.
Okay, and Alan, your your last 4 in.
It feels eerily similar. Kentucky just moved back up in with the win over Mississippi State, who I also have there. Wisconsin is the team that I just can't quit. And as a Marquette fan, that's really, really difficult to say. But there's nobody else on the bubble who has the quad 1 wins that they do, which is why I think they keep sticking in there. Though when it comes to that last team, I have Arizona State ahead of USC right now. USC is my first team out. Arizona State I have in. But those are two yo-yo teams. Every time it goes down, comes back up, I'm not sure which one's going to be there.
Yeah, so we have Memphis, Mississippi State, Wisconsin, and do not like this at all, Clemson. I think that's just gross and sick that we have them in, and just for that reason, we'll probably move them out before tomorrow's bracket comes out. But what I am saying, we have Kentucky one spot above that, so we're very, very close, I think, the three of us. The reason of Clemson, their resume doesn't show it. 344 non-conference strength of schedule. I was struggling for that last team to be put in. New Mexico loses. North Carolina loses. Oregon loses last night. USC, I can see any of those. Those are our first four teams out, by the way, but they all lost. And I wonder if Clemson can win enough to be in the top part of the ACC. Notre Dame got in. That was one of the things I sent to you guys. Notre Dame got in, and we didn't like their resume last year, and they finished second in the conference, and that's where it's not supposed to count, but I wonder if it does when it comes down to those last few teams. So those were my first four out. Alan, who do you have just outside your bracket?
Just outside, as I mentioned, I have USC out there, North Carolina, Clemson, and Seton Hall right now. Yep. I don't like Seton Hall's odds. I think that they can drop maybe one more, and they have a really tough schedule coming up. As far as Clemson and looking at Notre Dame last year, I see one very big difference between those two teams, and that is Notre Dame had a win over a very good Kentucky team. And Clemson doesn't have anything like that at the top of their resume. Like I said, USC is a yo-yo. And North Carolina, you're 0-9 against quad one. I mean, do something, anything at some point. I can't put them in right now. As fun as North Carolina, Kentucky, and Dayton would be.
Yeah, the other difference for me, with which I don't like Clemson being in, is their non-conference. Notre Dame had a top 25 non-conference schedule, and I think that was rewarded a little bit as well last year. Graham, your team's just outside the bubble.
Arizona State is my number one team outside, and frankly, I think they're the only team outside the bracket that I think has a good argument for being in. After that, I look at North Carolina, then Utah State, and actually Oklahoma has kind of just made a little bit of a late surge to creep back into range. They do have 4 wins against Quadrant 1. They do have 10 losses against Quadrant 1, but every single one of those is against Quadrant 1A. So you wonder if maybe the committee might give them a little bit of a break. When we referenced it earlier, they beat the brakes off of Alabama. They didn't just beat them. That was absolutely dominant win. If they pick up 1 or 2 more really good wins along the way, I wouldn't be surprised if they snuck in there.
So there you have it. You have some of the greatest minds in bracketology together for an hour talking a little bit of hoops. You see where there's a lot of agreement between the three of us. I think there's also some places where we've learned a little bit about maybe looking at a team. We see a guy who likes Marquette who's not high on Marquette, and we hopefully want to change his mind. We're all on his side, though, with that. That was a great part of this conversation. But gentlemen, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. Our contact in the last year and on our direct messaging. Let's keep that up. I'll try to check that a little more often than what I've been doing, because I miss out sometimes. It's great conversation. You provide a lot for our students as they can watch this now and learn a lot about the process that they're in. And you're just good people and good bracketologists, and I wish you nothing but the best. Share once again with anyone listening again where they can find your work. Alan, we'll start with you, and then Graham, and then we'll send you out to shovel some snow, Alan.
I'm at cracksidewalks.com and on Twitter at BrewCity1977. And if I can say one more thing, the team that I want to see in that isn't there yet is Penn State. If anybody can go first 4 to Final 4 with Jalen Pickett, with the way that team shoots, I would love to put them in. They're not there now, but I wish they were.
I agree. Graham?
On Twitter at Graham Doran, Doeren, and it's Graham Doran, bracketology.wordpress.com. Thanks for having us on.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I'd like to do this at least one more time with you guys. We do it normally with our students, and I might have you guys on with some students too, so that they can maybe ask some questions and you could just help them along the way as well. But for Delphi Bracketology, for Graham and Alan, I'm Brian Tonsoni. Thank you for watching.